Every Friday afternoon for 8 straight years, a silver courier van from Harwick and Lorne Financial stopped outside the same second-floor office on Dundas Street West in Toronto and dropped off another box of destroyed files. No call ahead, no explanation attached. Just a sticky note with a turnaround date, a signature line, and whatever mess the company's accounting teams had managed to create that week. Spreadsheets with conflicting totals. Tax filings with missing source documents. Payroll records where the numbers simply refused to add up. The kind of financial wreckage that, if left unaddressed, would have quietly buried a company under its own errors. The man upstairs sorted through every box alone. 8 years. Not once did anyone from Harwick and Lorne's executive floor ask his name in conversation. Not once did the senior partner who authorized the contract acknowledge him at an industry event. To them he was a line item, an outsourced problem solver. Useful the way a utility bill is useful, noticed only when it stops working. His name was Arthur Keene, 43 years old. Broad hands that had gone soft in some places and stayed rough in others, the way hands do when a man spends half his time at a keyboard and the other half doing everything else alone. Dark hair with gray coming in faster than he'd expected. Reading glasses he kept losing and finding again in coat pockets, on the edge of the bathroom sink, tucked into the sun visor of his Subaru. He wore the same rotation of flannel-lined shirts from October through April, not because he couldn't afford otherwise, but because he genuinely didn't think about it. His daughter Maeve thought about it enough for both of them. She was 11 and had opinions. Arthur ran a small forensic accounting practice, out of that second-floor office on Dundas. 2 rooms, a decent espresso machine, a whiteboard that had not been fully erased in 4 years, and a window that looked directly into the back wall of a parking garage. Not impressive, but the work that happened there was meticulous, patient, and occasionally the kind of thing that saved companies from themselves, without them ever fully understanding how close they had come to not being saved. He had not always worked alone. 6 years earlier, Arthur had been a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized audit firm downtown called Caldwell Partners. Good salary, respected team. The kind of career trajectory that felt stable until the morning it suddenly wasn't. His wife, Joelle, had been diagnosed in February. By June she was in palliative care at St. Michael's. By September, Arthur was standing at the back of a room in a Roncesvalles funeral home, watching people he barely knew hug his daughter, who was 5 years old and didn't fully understand why so many adults were crying. He took compassionate leave. The leave extended. The firm restructured. His position when he came back had been absorbed into 2 other roles. They offered him something lateral with less responsibility and the same title. He declined. He packed his desk into a banker's box, drove it home, and sat in his kitchen for 3 days before deciding that if he was going to rebuild, he would do it on terms that allowed him to be home when Maeve got off the school bus. The office on Dundas came later. A sublet from a paralegal who moved to Ottawa. 1 client became 3. 3 became a small roster of local businesses who needed someone to look at their books and tell them the truth. And then, 8 years ago, came Harwick and Lorne. The contract was routine at first. Quarterly reconciliation work. The kind of thing their internal team should have been able to manage but increasingly couldn't, due to turnover and a software migration that had gone badly, and produced 3 years of records nobody fully trusted. Arthur cleaned up. Methodically, without drama, the way he did everything. The contract renewed, then renewed again, then it became a standing arrangement. Those Friday courier drops, the silent exchange of boxes, the turnaround, the invoice that was always paid on the last possible day of net 30. He didn't mind the impersonal nature of it. The work was real. The work paid for Maeve's hockey registration, and her school trip to Quebec City, and the new roof that had become non-negotiable the autumn after Joelle died. Reliability matters when a child is depending on you. He understood that, with the particular clarity of someone who had learned it the hard way. Diane Harwick, the founding partner of Harwick and Lorne, had never set foot in Arthur's office. She was 51, known in Bay Street circles for her precision and her discomfort with ambiguity. She had built her firm from a 2-person practice in a shared Yonge Street suite into a 34-person operation with offices in Toronto, Calgary, and a small outpost in Halifax. She was profiled in a business magazine every few years. The photos always showed her at a boardroom table, looking like she had already solved the problem before the meeting began. Her staff found her demanding, in a way that felt impersonal rather than cruel. She optimized for outcomes without particular interest in the human texture of how those outcomes were reached. Internally, however, the firm had developed a quiet problem. The rapid expansion had stretched the compliance teams thin. Junior analysts were being promoted faster than their experience warranted. Several key files had been handled in ways that cut corners visible only in retrospect. A client audit had flagged inconsistencies in Harwick and Lorne's own oversight documentation. The Law Society had questions, the regulatory body had more. An internal review commissioned by the partners had surfaced something uncomfortable. Several of the firm's most significant errors, over the past 8 years, had been caught and corrected before they became catastrophic. The corrections were clean, professional, and completely invisible from the outside. They had originated consistently from one contracted external analyst. When Diane's operations director placed the summary on her desk on a Thursday afternoon in late November, she sat with it for a long time, 8 years. 14 major files stabilized. An estimated exposure of somewhere between $4 and $7 million in liability, quietly neutralized, no credit claimed, no leverage taken, just invoices, always modest, always within the agreed rate. The name at the bottom of each one, Arthur Keene CPA. Dundas Street, West Toronto. She had never once called him. The following Monday, Harwick and Lorne did not send a courier van. Arthur noticed, he didn't think much of it. Friday schedules shifted sometimes around month-end or holidays. He made Maeve's lunch, dropped her at school, came back to the office, and started working through a backlog for a small manufacturing client in Etobicoke. By Tuesday his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Keene. The voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of someone who didn't waste time on small talk, not because they were rude, but because they had long ago stopped noticing that other people used it to get comfortable. This is Diane Harwick. I'd like to come see you this week if you're available. Arthur set down his coffee. He recognized the name the way anyone in Toronto financial circles would recognize it. From the articles, from the industry events he occasionally attended, from the fact that her firm's name appeared on the remittance slips he'd been filing twice a year for close to a decade. Sure, he said. I'm here Wednesday afternoon. There was a brief pause. He suspected she was accustomed to people rearranging their Wednesday afternoons. Wednesday at 2, she said. Thank you. She arrived exactly on time. No assistant, no advance email with an agenda. Just Diane Harwick, standing in the doorway of his second-floor office, in a wool coat, the color of charcoal, looking at his whiteboard, and his 2 mismatched chairs, and the espresso machine on the filing cabinet, and saying nothing, for just long enough to make it slightly awkward. Arthur gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. Your office is smaller than I expected, she said, not unkindly, more the way a person says something true out loud because they've lost the habit of filtering. It does the job, Arthur said. She had a folder with her. She placed it on the desk between them, but didn't open it. I've been reviewing your work, she said. 8 years of it, in more detail than I probably should have needed to. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has recently had to update their understanding. Something they thought they already knew. You've been carrying a significant part of our risk exposure, without, as far as I can tell, ever once telling anyone. I was correcting errors, Arthur said. That was the job. The job we gave you was quarterly reconciliation. The job you gave me, he said, not unkindly, kept arriving with problems attached. I dealt with the problems. There was a silence. Outside, a streetcar went past on Dundas. Somewhere below, someone was unloading something heavy from a truck. The firm is under review, Diane said. Regulatory. The details are not for public circulation yet, but they will be soon enough. We have a compliance gap that our internal team is not equipped to address on the timeline we've been given. She paused. I came here because the evidence suggests you understand our filing history better than anyone currently employed by us. Arthur looked at her steadily. He had, over the years, thought about this company with the same detached professionalism he brought to everything. It was a client. The work was real. The pay was reliable. He had not spent much time thinking about the people behind it, or what they thought of him. Now one of them was sitting across from his desk in a wool coat. And he found himself thinking about the 14 times in 8 years He had caught something that could have collapsed a client-late relationship. A regulatory standing. A reputation decades in the making. And had fixed it quietly, invoiced for the agreed rate, and moved on. He thought about the Friday afternoons. Maeve sat at the small desk, in the corner of his office, doing her homework, while he worked through the Harwick boxes. She had started doing that when she was 6. Colored pencils spread across the folding table, asking him questions about what he was doing. Him explaining, in whatever simplified form made sense for a 6-year-old, what it meant when numbers didn't match, and why it mattered that you found the reason. He thought about the roof, the school trip, the hockey six she'd outgrown twice, and he thought about the regulatory review Diane had just described, and the staff whose livelihoods were attached to a firm whose stability had been, in part, dependent on work they'd never acknowledged. "What do you need?" he said, "and what's the timeline?" The relief on Diane's face was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. 6 weeks, she said, possibly 8. I need someone to review the past 3 years of compliance documentation, identify every gap, and help us produce a remediation record that holds up to external scrutiny. That's not quarterly reconciliation, Arthur said. No, she said, it isn't. I can offer a contract rate that reflects the scope. I'll need full access, every file, internal communications relevant to the flagged periods. Direct contact with your compliance lead, not filtered through an assistant. Done. And I work from here, she said. I pick my daughter up at 3:30. I'm available by phone after 8 most evenings if something is urgent. She didn't hesitate. Understood. He nodded once and reached for his notepad. The 6 weeks that followed were the most demanding Arthur had worked since Joelle got sick. And he'd spent 3 months trying to hold his professional life together with one hand, while his personal life came apart in the other. He drove downtown twice a week for working sessions with Diane's compliance team. Young analysts who were competent but scared, who had been handed a problem larger than their experience, and were grateful. In the way that people are when someone arrives and actually knows what they're doing, without making them feel worse about the fact that they hadn't. He was patient with them. Not in a performed, pedagogical way. Just in the way of someone who remembered being 26 and overwhelmed in a system that rarely explained itself. He showed them what he was looking for, and why. He let them work through problems before stepping in. He answered questions without making the questioner feel foolish for asking. Diane observed all of this. She made no comment about it during those weeks, but she watched. There were late nights when the scope of a particular gap required more than the standard session. On those evenings, Arthur would call Mrs. Okafor, his neighbor on Blantyre Avenue, who had looked after Maeve in emergencies since she was 7, and treated the arrangement with the quiet competence of someone who understood that single parents sometimes need a backup plan that asks for nothing in return, except a batch of shortbread at Christmas. He always made the shortbread himself. Maeve helped with the icing. One Tuesday evening, Diane stayed later than her team. She found Arthur at the conference room table, files organized in a system that made immediate sense even to an outside eye, working through a source document that had been misfiled 18 months earlier and had caused a quiet ripple of errors ever since. He had a cup of cold coffee beside him that he hadn't noticed was cold. Your daughter, Diane said, sitting across from him. How old? 11, he said, without looking up. Then he looked up. Why, you mentioned her when we set the terms. 3:30 pickup, every day, he said. Yes. Diane was quiet for a moment. She was not. Arthur had come to understand. A person who spoke in order to fill silence. She spoke when she had something to say. I lost my father when I was 9, she said. My mother worked 2 jobs for 4 years after. I didn't understand that until I was much older. She paused. I'm not sure why I said that. Arthur looked at her. Probably because it's relevant, he said. Then he went back to the file. She sat with him for another hour, not working, just present, drinking her own coffee that also went cold. It was, Arthur thought, possibly the most honest hour anyone from Harwick and Lorne had spent with him in 8 years. The remediation package took 7 weeks in the end. Arthur delivered it on a Thursday morning in January, printed and indexed and formatted to a standard that the external reviewer would later describe, in a written assessment, as exceptionally thorough. The regulatory process moved forward. The gaps were addressed. The exposure was manageable. the firm's standing held. When it was over, Diane called him, not through the compliance team, not through an assistant. Directly, from her own phone, at 8:15 on a Thursday morning. The review came back clean, she said.
Good, he said.
A pause. I'd like to talk to you about a longer arrangement. Arthur was standing in his kitchen, watching Maeve eat cereal, and read the back of the box with the focused attention she gave to anything printed, which had been one of her characteristics since she learned to read, and which he suspected she had inherited, like her mother's laugh and her own particular way of being quietly stubborn, from Joelle. What kind of arrangement, he said. A proper one, Diane said. Not another box through a courier, I mean a formal consulting partnership. Retained, with scope, with a brief pause that in anyone else might have been uncertainty, but in Diane Harwick sounded more like deliberate revision of a sentence she'd already composed. With the acknowledgement that we should have done this years ago. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Maeve looked up from the cereal box, assessed whatever expression was on his face, decided it didn't require comment, and went back to reading. I'd want it in writing, he said, with clear scope, no ambiguity about deliverables or access, obviously, and the rate reflects the actual work, not the rate we negotiated 8 years ago. Also obvious, she said. He thought he heard something that might have been the leading edge of a dry smile. I'll have the draft to you by Friday. He accepted the partnership, not because of what it meant financially, though that mattered. Maeve was 11, and hockey was expensive, and university had a way of arriving before you'd fully prepared for it. He accepted it because the work was real, and because the people at that firm, the junior analysts, who were scared and getting better, deserved the kind of stability that came from having competent oversight, rather than hoping the problems got quietly corrected by someone they'd never met. He also accepted because Diane Harwick, for all her precision and her impersonal efficiency, and her 8 years of treating him like a useful line item, had sat across from him in a conference room at 8:15 on a Tuesday evening, and said something true without preparing it. That counted for something. The Friday courier van did not return, instead a standing weekly call, a shared file system with actual access, introductions to the broader team, by name, in an all-staff memo that Diane wrote herself, and which described Arthur's work over the past 8 years in terms that were accurate and, to the staff who read it, somewhat revelatory. Several of them sent emails afterward saying some version of, "Oh, so that's who fixed the Meridian file." He replied to each one briefly and without ceremony. Maeve, for her part, took it in stride. She had grown up watching her father work, the long evenings, the quiet focus, the particular satisfaction he took in a reconciled set of numbers that had started the day as a mess. She knew, in the way children know things they haven't been explicitly taught, that what he did mattered. She had once, in grade 4, told a classmate that her dad found money that companies had lost without knowing they'd lost it, which was not a technically precise description of forensic accounting but was, Arthur admitted to himself, not entirely wrong. One evening in March, a few months into the new arrangement, Diane came to the Dundas office for a working session that ran long. When it ended, Arthur made 2 cups of coffee, the espresso machine being one area of his professional life where he had not cut corners, and they sat for a while talking about nothing in particular. The parking garage wall outside the window, the shortbread that had appeared on the corner of his desk, made by Maeve and wrapped in wax paper because she had decided, after hearing about Diane, that this was appropriate. Diane ate 2 pieces and said they were excellent. Arthur agreed. "Can I ask you something?" Diane said. "Sure, all those files, all those years, you never once picked up the phone and told us what you were finding." Arthur considered this. "You didn't ask," he said. "That's not an answer." He looked at the window. The parking garage was lit orange at night, which he'd stopped noticing but suddenly noticed again. "The errors were fixable," he said. "Calling attention to them wouldn't have fixed them faster. And the contract doesn't specify that I was supposed to." He paused. "Also," he said, more quietly, "I needed the contract to stay stable. I had a daughter and a roof and no backup plan." Diane was quiet for a long moment. "That's honest," she said. "You asked." She nodded slowly. Then she said something that Arthur didn't entirely expect. "I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to manage it that way." He looked at her. He didn't say it wasn't her fault, because, in some meaningful sense it had been. Not through malice, but through the particular inattention of people who optimize for outcomes, and forget to notice the people producing them. He didn't say it was fine, because it hadn't entirely been fine. There had been years when the invisibility of the work had sat heavily, in a way he'd never had anyone to name it to. He said, "It got better," which was true. There is a version of this story where Arthur gets angry, where he leverages what he knows, where the moment Diane walks into his office becomes a transaction. Debt collected, terms reversed. That version exists. He had thought about it, in the occasional late-night moment when the unfairness of 8 years pressed hard against his better instincts. He chose differently, not because he was naive about what had happened or sentimental about the people involved. Because anger, in his experience, was expensive. It cost concentration, it cost sleep, it cost the particular quality of attention that his daughter deserved when she sat across from him at dinner, and told him something that mattered. He could not afford, in any of the ways that word applies, to spend his reserves on bitterness. That spring, Maeve started asking him more deliberately about the work, not just what he was fixing but why things broke in the first place. She was 12 by then, old enough to follow a real explanation. He gave her one. She listened with the focused, slightly skeptical attention that he suspected she would eventually turn toward something significant, law, maybe, or medicine, or whatever field she chose for the particular pleasure of understanding a system completely. He thought about Joel sometimes in those conversations. Joelle had been a librarian, which was not as unlike forensic accounting as it sounded. Both involved the conviction that information had a right order, and that finding it mattered. She would have liked watching Maeve ask precise questions. She would have liked, he thought, how things had turned out, not the path that had led there, which had been hard and costly in ways that didn't fully go away, but the destination, the Dundas office, the espresso machine, the wax paper shortbread, the parking garage wall, orange at night. By the following year, Arthur had expanded slightly. One contract analyst who worked 2 days a week and was very good, and left promptly at 4 to pick up her own kids. A second room that finally got a proper chair. The whiteboard, which he had still not fully erased, had acquired a new layer of notations that Maeve had recently declared indecipherable, which he took as a sign of progress. Harwick and Lorne continued to thrive. This time with oversight architecture that actually worked. The junior analysts who had been scared in November were, by the following autumn, less scared and more competent, which was what they had needed all along. Diane called Arthur once a week, usually on Thursdays, usually around 9 in the morning. The calls were professional, and occasionally, at the edges, something adjacent to friendly. He didn't forget the 8 years. He didn't think forgetting was the point. The point was that the work he had done during those years had been real, regardless of whether anyone had recognized it. The roof had held. The school trips had happened. Maeve had grown from a 5-year-old who didn't understand why people were crying at her mother's funeral into a 12-year-old who asked precise questions and made shortbread and had opinions about flannel shirts. The numbers had always added up. It had just taken a while for the people to catch up.